Hello, welcome to Global Mission to Peace and Mystic View number 38. We're joined with Dan Winter, and we're going to be discussing the infrastructure of bliss. And of course, I'm joined by Shelley. Hello, Shelley.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
And Dan Winter, and I'm going to put this on speaker view because there we go. All right.
So Shelley, nice to be with you again.
So Shelley, do you want to begin this?
Well, I don't want to be remiss in not introducing Dan appropriately, but he's so very, very well known and is so prolific in the materials that he shares and makes it so, everything that I have learned from Dan is about shareable thoughts, shareable energy. So I first want to acknowledge that and thank you, because we've all learned so much because of that generosity on your part. But shareable thoughts, that really ties us right into bliss, which is where we want to go.
Oh, exactly. Really, the issue is that what is the most shareable wave is a wave that can be distributed without destructive interference. And obviously, we've talked about pent within pent and golden ratio and the rose petal and the pine cones kissing. And that metaphor directly applies to how waves become centripetal and implode charge. And that is the physics that truly is what happens when you have bliss. You implode your electrical environment, which is one reason why you want to do it in a nice environment and not in a metal room with bad air, because you're literally imploding your room space. And when you do that, you become that space, you become centripetal. And we fed and provided all of that electric field geometry into the Therify, and that's one of the reasons why so many, particularly women, have bliss experiences in the Therify.
Well, does the Therify relate at all to the four-wave mixing? I've been trying to really understand the premise so that I can explain it. I'm so excited about the Therify, and I'm finding as I make my analogies, there's a few holes. I'd really appreciate it if you could flesh that out a little bit for us.
Well, right. I mean, the original physics in phase conjugate optics was lasers had to meet exactly opposing pairs, which is called four-wave mixing because you have incident angles that look like a cube. And so you're basically setting up a cube to start with. And the lasers have to be so precisely opposing. And the metaphor for this is exactly the way brain waves work. You have two hemispheres for exactly this reason, because it has to be implosive, constructive compression, or literally constructive wave cancellation between the hemispheres, between the lasers, between the opposite wave fronts in the two tubes of the Therify. So that perfectly constructive interference, or in this case, constructive collapse or constructive mutual cancellation, is exactly what phase conjugation is how pine cones can kiss noses without hurting each other. Because that wave at the center is canceled in a very particular way. It's imploded by golden ratio right at the Planck sphere dimension through the speed of light into a longitudinal wave. Phase conjugate pine cone converts the transverse up and down electromagnetic down the translation of vorticity down the cone into the longitudinal compressible, sometimes called scalar or torsional, which everyone knows that longitudinal wave is faster than light, the mechanism of healing, and clearly the physics of why we get remote healing effects with Therify, that sort of thing. So it's all part of that physics of the waves opposing each other precisely.
Right. So, but that also would it be correct to say it reverses time? Or what's the time element? Because it's going back as distance, which we could relate to as time. However, my question is, I would like to understand, is there not a component that requires the antimatter of the matter?
Well, it's quite simple that matter and antimatter are, remember, matter is just a name for a wave of charge going up and down and staying in one place that stores some inertia, which is the only definition we have for mass. And when that inertia or charge rotates, it creates an interval, which is our only definition of time. So we're only talking about charge rotating when we define both mass and time. Now, when physics says that we have time reversal in phase conjugate optics, it's a very limited and specific sense there, because always what they mean by time reversal or going back into the past is returning to a more ordered state. So in fact, the very limited condition in which physics has documented time reversal is specifically and only negentropy, increased order.
Mm.
So, time reversal is very limited in its definition here. Going backwards in time, for example, we always talked before, you can time reverse rusted steel to unrusted, but not the reverse. You cannot return to disorder. No, it doesn't happen. Which is why stem cell de-differentiation, it's a whole story of how phase conjugate fields like Therify can potentially de-differentiate stem cells, because they go back to max order at the root of the fractal, which is the definition of the word stem. So there's a lot of conversation could be had here.
That is really, really beautiful. I love that. And as you were saying, first you form the cube, first you come out of the cube,
Yes.
but how does that relate, like, say, to the 7 arrows? So really the bottom line here of my question is, I'm wondering if we can, by holding thought, create that kind of compression within our own hearts to then create that sort of negentropic relationship.
Well, that's beautiful, and that's the right question. And, the 7 arrows, which is the original book by Hieronymus Storm, refers to the 7 layers also of heart muscle, which are exactly in the 7 axes of spin symmetry of the tetrahedron, as in the Pettigrew dissections from Field of Form, Lawrence Edwards' Vortex of Life, which is the classic anthroposophic. So the 7 arrows of the heart are just simply the 7 spin symmetry arrows of the tetracube, which has more symmetry than anything in the universe, obviously. And so that sets up the condition, the precondition for conjugate implosion, namely 4-wave mixing the cube. So you start with the tetracube, but you don't finish with it. And that's why always, even how the Cherokee have the 7 arrows in the Arboretum, Dahani Wahoo, the 7 arrows are on the outside, but inside, in the Ophanim sigil and the Anu, you have 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside, meaning that you initiate the implosive compression with a perfect cube, which also has a hex view, flower of life, etc. But when those lasers meet in a cube, 4-wave mixing or imposing, they complete the conjugation in something called a super high dielectric barium strontium titanate, the phase conjugate mirror itself, which takes that cube and allows rotated embedding, where the cube is the chin. This is more than metaphor, it's wave mechanics. The chin angle of the Sphinx is 32 degrees because that's the angle you tip a cube up to rotate and blink 5 times, and the cube becomes dodeca or pent. And that's the climax step of the whole flower of life story too, where hex becomes pent. So the 7 arrows was outside, but then the 5 arrows was inside, which means that's the spin symmetry slip knot of the Anu, which is the heart of the sun, the heart of hydrogen, heart of the human, and the actual slip knot that formed, the subatomic physics. And we tell the shamanic story of how you use those 7 arrows and 7 layers of visualization, the 7 sign, 7 seal, which is a 7 braid superposed symmetry of DNA braid recursion. And at our website, 7arrows.net. So it is the completion of the conjugate moment when the cube then rotates from a hex 7-arrow symmetry into a pent. And that was the climax step of the flower of life. And Drindlow rightfully said, well, the last step is dangerous, which is to go from hex to pent, because if you're not ready, you get spaced out, scrambled eggs. And that test is simply, are you a shareable wave? Meaning, do you have pure intention? Meaning, do you have some information that can be distributed, which is of service to all, which makes you then insoluble in the collective unconscious, the physics of which is longitudinal wave mechanics, literally the fractal field.
Right. So now we could replicate that. If we can replicate that with thought, we could replicate that with matter as well. For example, building our homes or building our communities, as you said, creating the cup within the cup, or the Holy Grail, where the inside is identical to the outside. And also within water. So if you would tell us a little bit about maybe the water imploder, how that would serve, and I mean, I see in Alberta you just recently had great results with medical, I think it was the medical, was it cannabis, that big industry, but then also perhaps we could bring it into bioarchitecture, which we've only heard about through you, so I'd love to have you introduce that a bit further for us.
Well, you're bringing up all our favorite conversations. Well, it's true that at theimploder.com, the super imploder was documented to 60%. In many cases, growth increased by weight in cannabis hemp. And that was replicated in South America as well. 30 to 60% is typical. So cannabis hemp particularly loves the super imploder, which is obviously the solubility effect. You have the implosive vortex nozzle, which is piezoelectric if the water is conductive, for example, in the biodynamic preparation, rock powder, which makes the activity of the vortex nozzle itself bioactive. And that's then dumped into the supermagnetic, and that results in the magnetic rotor effect. And you have the dramatic spin density increase, molecular cluster size decrease, and solubility increase radically. And that's the solubility bioactivity increase, which is so famous for the superimploder. It's good not for just plants, but people. So that's true. And to extend that conversation, then we have 3 going on 4 major international TheraPhi centers, especially Belgium and Norway now, which are using the superimploder in the imploder spa with the TheraPhi plasma, because the synergy is amazing. For example, they've had documented cases of psoriasis solved by using the superimploder, recirculating water in the imploder spa, a dramatic solution to skin problems, many other problems. Hydration effects. You have the healing water in the spa, which is very synergetic to the TheraPhi effect. So this is happening. It's working well, and we're very pleased. And you know, the TheraPhi itself has been documented to be a bioactive field, dramatically affecting seed growth, just like Stonehenge did. We know the electrical engineering for why.
I would love to think that we're able to bring Bliss to water. After all that we've done with water and all that water has carried us through, you know, it would be lovely to give back some Bliss and think that we can impact that. But look at water with the hydrogen molecule, and as you said, it was the heart of hydrogen, the heart of Anu.
Yes, well, we are the ones who wrote the equation to prove that the 3 radii of hydrogen are golden ratio exact integer exponents of Planck length and time, meaning that hydrogen is profoundly fractal, the center of the water and the DNA ladder rung. And it's true that restoring Bliss to water is a beautiful metaphoric way of saying restored centripetal forces, which is the essence of what Bliss is you become charge radiant, what Bliss is, if you become charge implosive. So becoming centripetal is step 1 for Bliss and for water. And that's what the imploder is designed to do, yes.
Well, Radagast, you've been looking into hemp production, what is required, and also into bioarchitecture.
Yes. Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up was I wanted to, I don't see my face coming up, so I don't know. Am I on the screen for you?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay. So anyway, Dan, I recently built something like this. You know, this kind of pyramid.
Right.
It's like, I guess, what's called the Russian pyramid. And from what I understand, the effects of it are 3 times the height. So this is a foot high. So like, you know, a 3 foot radius of effect. And supposedly it's good for growing things. And it makes me think of also the Irish towers that are seen in a really great book I read called Secrets of the Soil. Not only do they have the Irish towers, but they also mention the rock dust.
Exactly. Yes.
And how important that is. So anyway, I was putting this by my pillow because it would be within the 3 foot radius, and I found it had effects. Do you know? Are you familiar with that sort of pyramid and the field it puts out?
Yeah, the Russian pyramid guy was teaching with us in Paris recently. Yeah, the concept was good, actually, although the Russians have screwed up in some of their new ones. They're using steel and aluminum, which is a huge mistake, yes. Which brings up the point I wanted to make to you, which was that it's the capacitance of that device which actually gives it the power. So any kind of thin film coating or the capacitance of the material used is critical, actually. Cardboard's not bad, but so obviously a thin film of gold would be great, but there are lots of material that can have a high dielectric that'll result in an implosive capacitance. And you would measure that with a spectrum analysis of the weak capacitive field, which would then prove to you how it was bioactive. So the actual physics has to do with making capacitance, literally the plates recursive. And high dielectric materials serve that function because, as you know, the dielectric constant is the sort of definition of biologic materials in general for biologic architecture. That is the quality of resonance of the insulator between the plates of the capacitor that allow effective resonance. It's literally how to make a perfect echo, like the Sufi in Meetings with Remarkable Men. So that the perfect echo is the dielectric that's super, which is why things like a monoatomic material or a thin film gold, anything that makes the capacitance recursive. So you're having fun playing with the ratios of dimensions, great. I would next encourage you to play with material choices to amplify the capacitance.
All right. Because I did see a video with somebody who was able to, had an app on their phone that was able to, I guess, measure picoteslas, or even just, you know.
Well, actually, the way we demonstrated at goldenmean.info/biophoton, and we use a weak capacitive coupling, aka Callahan. By the way, Callahan is the one who documented that the level of the dirt in the stone Irish towers was adjusted for bioactive field. For example, when they adjusted the dirt level for 1,000 hertz, they achieved a pain reduction for birthing. And we now know the physics of why. And so these were tuned, actually.
Yes.
And we documented that with Callahan, worked with him in Florida. And so the bioactive field generation in general is related to, the microwave conductivity. And, Callahan was a pioneer applying this to insect navigation. And applied to architecture, it's why biologic materials have to be high dielectric, which means that molecules that were once part of biology, like limestone, rearrange the molecular geometry to be more fractal or recursive or high dielectric, which means charge distribution efficiency, which is the physics of why biologic materials in general are better for architecture, because they allow the capacitance to breathe your aura.
So with building, when people are, like a wood structure and they're putting dry board on, which is largely gypsum covered with paper, how is that as a building material?
The wood is good. Of course, hardwood's a little better, but the wood is good. The gypsum is not bad. There are trace mineral materials, for example, a little bit of quartz powder or calcite would do fabulous things to that gypsum, actually making it, resonate capacitively. But anything that turns that capacitance into a high dielectric, which is basically, as we said before, it's why Steiner said the kids in the kindergarten should never touch anything synthetic, steel, plastic, or synthetics. Kids should only touch and work with biological materials, stone and wood and natural fabrics. And the physics is because your aura cannot embed. And ultimately, your aura cannot steer any tornado it cannot embed in. So it literally can't become part of your electric body.
Understood. So gypsum's at least neutral as a building material?
Gypsum's not, it's a stone. It's not bad. The steel nails are kind of bad news, but, but the problem is the electrosmog in the metal, actually.
Well, do you know who Thomas Sheridan is? He's from Ireland. No, he speaks a lot, and he did some, he used to build radios, and he said the most fascinating thing he ever did was using a quartz crystal that he had found in the field and made a radio out of it. He was able to get reception. But what he was saying was one of the reasons that modern electrosmog is particularly bad for us is because it's digital. So it's producing square wave output as opposed to old sine waves. Like when we had regular TVs, we had a lot of electrosmog, but it came in sine wave forms that weren't as deleterious to us, apparently. Do you agree with that as a concept?
It's a bit vague, but useful in that, ultimately, if the analog waveform is short enough, it is a digital waveform. So there's a bit of a trade-off there.
Okay.
But the real issue, to get to the pure principle there, is ultimately successful embedding or constructive interference. For example, it turns out that 50 hertz, the European power, is an integer golden exponent of Planck, whereas 60 hertz is not.
Oh.
And embeddability ultimately is the difference between mind and depth of mind, actually. So the harmonic series, which produces mind, for example, in the Schumann harmonics and the brainwave harmonics and the Therapy harmonics, is precisely embeddable. We know what the definition of sacred is for length and time, and that's the whole dimensional analysis. So, I think the difference between analog and digital is oversimplified for people, really. The question is simply, well, here's a practical example. We had a conference in Switzerland, outside of Geneva, and we had 4 people in front of the room with computer transformers. And, they were all operating their computer, teaching, and we realized that particularly the women in the audience, were getting nausea. And we decided to experiment. Everybody unplugged all their transformers at once, and suddenly the room went through a wave of euphoria. And you recognize that this gradually builds up in your home. And the reason the transformers produce nausea and lack of digestion, lack of grounding, and lack of concentration, literally, is because the waveform cannot become centripetal. Now, it's possible to design a waveform that creates centripetal forces, which is what the Schumann cascade is. So we could reinvent our power grid to actually become self-aware And that brings up a whole other conversation. But in the very minimum, people need to realize when they create waveforms that prevent attention, it's the physics of why, fluorescent light prevents attention span. It's been measured. Whereas if you take the fluorescent lights out of your kid's classroom, put sunlight in, it's a dramatic increase in measured attention span. Now that we know the physics of what attention is, which is imploded wave function, it's literally centripetal force.
How is LED lighting?
We have a new business partner for bioactivefield.com and the bioactive lighting, who has just shipped here the first prototype of bioactive LED lighting.
Oh, exciting. Really?
Well, it's the same question. If you get the frequency signature right, which is my bumper sticker, and but if you design the orange and the purple, actually for my equation for photosynthesis, which is phase conjugate optically, obviously, which is, Planck golden ratio exponents. And so you can make LED lighting that creates attention, but of course you need to know what you're doing. But it gets back to that old book, Health and Light. John Ott, he told the story correctly, but he didn't understand the principle. The frequency of the lighting determines whether you feed or destroy attention. Mercury vapor lighting is about as poison as it gets, and yet they use it in health food stores all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I worked at a woodworking place briefly, and they had that sodium mercury, I guess it is.
It's a frequency signature. That's why, they know that artist lighting and full spectrum lighting imitates the solar frequency spectrum and creates attention span. But now we know why, and we know how to perfect that.
Mm-hmm. And that would be by kind of amping up the orange and the purple?
Well, it isn't just the orange and purple. It's actually using the equation on the cover of my book to know what frequencies create attention and what destroy attention. It's very simple. Planck length and time times integer exponent golden ratio, and you know the recipe. And that's how you make attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so I have a person who wants to bring new designs based on what you've brought to us in building. Like, these are people who are going to be now building homes from scratch. And so the challenge is what shape, because we're trying, if we're going to be starting from scratch with the idea of trying to make newer kinds of communities, more integration, doesn't that mean we should probably try to get away from the square homes or the rectangular homes?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Remember, we've been teaching biologic architecture for about 20 years, and we have curriculums, actually people teaching the curriculum in 3 or 4 countries. The leading groups are Olda in Prague and Michael Rice in Czech and Ireland, and of course, Psychogeometria are leaders in Mexico City. So there's very advanced people doing biologic architecture in these groups. And that curriculum and these contexts are all at goldenmean.info/architecture. So just an intro to your question. But to answer your question specifically, reminds me of a story. Gus Ciccacci, who founded our first international conference in Florence with Bucky Fuller. And Gus had built his home in the shape of one DNA ladder rung. And if you know what that is, it's a hex, it's a rather a pent, and then a hex, and then a golden ratio rectangle. And then a pent and a hex again. So that is the shape, literally, of one rung of the ladder of DNA. And that was Gus Ciccacci's house. And there were some lessons to be learned here. That in the hex place, which you have maximum destructive wave interference called incubation, you have charge isolation, which is perfect for snowflakes and destructive wave interference and preventing charge from being distributed, which is a great place for secrets. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the pent basis, dodeca, pentadeca, you have the opposite, which is golden ratio, and constructive wave interference, which is charge distribution, which is where secrets are not possible.
Right.
And in that part of the house, you do activities where you want to do distribution. But in the parts of the house where you get the point that nature uses hex and cube functions for very specific things, which is simply to isolate charge. And nature uses pent and golden ratio, which is the shape of every living protein, by the way, where it wants to distribute charge. And that directly applies to what part of the house you design and what geometry.
Well, with that, okay, so now I understand the difference between some of the 3 basic shapes of pent, square, and hex. But if you're building a home, would you still be able to use the square shape, and then how would you incorporate this into somebody building a small home and trying to? We know the material part.
Yeah. Well, The short answer is that, and Michael Rice and the other biological architects have worked with this beautifully for years. But the short answer is, as we taught for many years in the physics of Feng Shui, that the Chinese were right, which was that square corners are Feng Shui evil. But we now know the physics because they create capacitive destructive interference, just like a square in astrology. So the answer to your question, obviously, then is spheres are bad in general. Squares are bad, at least a conventional square. Now, golden rectangle, that sort of thing. What Michael actually evolved to, Michael Rice, who probably leads this area in many ways intuitively, is egg shapes. So, egg shapes in biological architecture are beautiful. And the idea is to create a living wave function. We did find that people who live in spheres really do tend to have a problem, actually.
Oh, interesting. I guess I'm thinking about from like creating blueprints. I mean, if we're going to be having new structures, we're going to have architects who can conceive literally outside the box.
Yes. No, and these things like straw bale, which have beautiful capacitance, and rammed earth, which have beautiful capacitance, and that curriculum is all at goldenmean.info/architecture.
Okay.
We have a beautiful description of the whole curriculum, and it basically involves making a living capacitance in the walls.
Okay, but now is that living capacitance more based on material than shape of what you're building?
Always both. The material is the molecular geometry, and the shape of the walls is the macromolecular geometry. And if you have self-similarity.
Yeah, I'm just trying to develop a language for people when I'm speaking to who are actually coming to me to inform some of their builders, like, well, how do we proceed?
Yes. And, as I say, that curriculum has evolved. In fact, we actually have an architecture for deserts as well, and we have an architecture for the Spanish cultures as well. So that curriculum is well evolved.
Well, now, if I recall, in Feng Shui, in most cases, the entrance of your home should be facing south.
There's a certain metaphor there as well. For example, in Feng Shui, they had it right. You often want to face east or north because you face the direction from which the charge wind is blowing, for the same reason that a sailor must face into the wind to steer. But also, if your house is on a hill, then chances are the charge wind is going down that hill, and so you want to face up the hill. And that metaphor applies exactly to where you put the mouth of a labyrinth as well.
Because, I also know in Feng Shui, usually they want a dragon, like in the north, like a kind of like a hilly protector, so to speak. Which I think they call a dragon. I'm not familiar with Feng Shui.
The ideal Feng Shui layout, it has the land geometry and the water relationships just like the feminine organs of a lady, really, which is very, very appropriate. Uphill you have and then you have the water feature, and you have the valley, and it's basically a way to contain charge in a way that becomes centripetal.
So how about constructing a home in the shape of a pentagon? Is that too much energy collection for a home?
It would be a place where it would be hard to have secrets. It would be a place where your dreaming would go toward distribution more than conservation. For certain kinds of function, it would be good. I might comment, every indigenous tribe on the planet is very clear. You do not live in the sacred space.
So let me ask you, I recently spent a few weeks on a boat, and many of my community there lived their entire lives on boats. How does that bode for them being constantly, would that be bleeding away the charge? Or
just 1 second here. No, I'm with you here. Well, actually, the classic Feng Shui, I believe, has it that, and I guess there's some personal experience here, that actually life on a boat is bad Feng Shui. It's the short. And the reason for that is, let me give you an example. The most advanced school of geobiology here in Europe, Stefan Cardino's GenieDeLieu.ch out of Geneva, they have charts that show why your aura collapses when you walk over a water vein. In fact, it's a way of calibrating your aura. They have you walk over a water vein and measure the amount of collapse. Now, why does your aura collapse when you walk over a water vein? For the same reason that the advanced builders like Olden Prague, they actually designed the house to put the walls over the water vein so that people don't sleep or sit on the water vein. So why is it so bad in geobiology or feng shui to sleep or sit on a water vein? Well, it's really quite simple. As the children are driving by, if they hear the sound of a living river, every child wants to pee. It's because the water wants to join the life force. So when you walk over living water, your aura goes bye-bye because it follows the life force. So sleeping or walking or sitting on a water vein is extremely bad news geobiologically because your aura is going away. And they measure that actually, and they calibrate their aura index by doing that. So it's a beginning of a conversation about probably from a geobiology or feng shui viewpoint, life on water is not the best.
Well, I wonder if you could take on the aura of the ocean. But anyways, we'll save that for another conversation unless you have an immediate thought on it.
Well, I recommend the book Psychonavigation, which is actually about using lucid dreaming to steer.
Okay. Okay, and so let's bring this to lighting for our communities and our homes. We spoke a little bit earlier about kind of ionized gases, but that's also what plasma is. So what's the difference between using, say, an ionized gas or a plasma as opposed to maybe bringing that through a crystalline form? And so that's a kind of a two-pronged question. But we could start there because in the EO book of the ancient Gnostic text, there was a little bit of a mystery to me. It said azozio, and azozio is a crystal that I think receives light at a specific angle. So I'm always looking for that.
Well, to start, the ionized gases, like, of course, mercury vapor lights, produce a spectrum which is maximally poisonous, as we said. Whereas the noble gas, remember, noble gases are defined noble precisely because of the fractality, that is the completion of the electron shell geometry, self-similar to the nucleus. So noble gases are classic conjugators, and conjugators in the optical spectrum are very high frequency conjugators that are beautiful. And so the noble gas then is conjugated with the low frequency spectrum, which perfectly fits that, and that's what Therify is. So, and plasma is famous for healing cancers, and if you do it with a conjugate arrangement like Therify, you have the best of both worlds. It's a fabulous thing. Now, in classic crystal geometry, for example, a quartz crystal, the frequencies of capacitance available to you are very limited. And so, a classic quartz crystal, even a crystal skull, for example, is going to be very narrow spectra and not implosive in any kind of broad spectral, and the opposite of conjugator. But, the perfect crystal, that a truly conjugate crystal, that gets into exactly what the Philosopher's Stone is, exactly what Lucifer's Eye is, exactly what the Kaaba Stone is, which is a pure phase conjugate broad spectral crystal, which is exactly the physics of alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone. And what John Dee's scrying stone was, and what the coating that made the bottom of Nostradamus' scrying cup work. And that coating is obviously a phase conjugate dielectric. And to give the example of why the Philosopher's Stone, which was originally the Kaaba stone of the Muslims, Lucifer's Eye, worked, the physics was that, the glass meteorite, like the red glass of the Templars, had vaporized gold propagate through it when the meteorite was approaching. It's the only metal that survived the impact of the meteorite. And when you propagate vaporized gold through the foam geometry of the crystallizing glass in the right macromolecular temperatures, the real physics of the Philosopher's Stone, what you get is the macromolecular glass foam, self-similar to the micromolecular of the monatomic gold in the gold vapor propagated through that. And that's what was ground up from the Mad Caliph to make the original red powder that Dee and Kelly used to make the purest gold ever measured on this planet by the British Royal Society. So, it is absolutely possible to make a phase conjugate dielectric, and that is what the perfect crystal was, and that was John Dee's life, and the scrying stone and the philosopher's stone, and that's advanced science. But that's where alchemy leads, and it's pure charge implosion.
It's interesting that you mentioned how a mercury sodium light has a toxic output, because I remember reading, I think you might know who Guru Das was. He wrote Gem Elixirs Vibrational Healing.
I knew him, yeah.
And in one of the books, he's describing how earlier they had invented harmoniums, which was like rotating crystals that you would depress it on, and you would kind of like create multiple singing bowl effect as you kind of create a pedal and turn this thing. But the earliest harmoniums were made of lead crystal. And they found out that after prolonged periods, not even that prolonged, but any kind of exposure to that music made was producing neurological problems and disease, is just almost like lead in your water. So it really, what seems to be obvious with whether it's mercury lighting or lead crystal sound, the neurological toxicity of both of these elements is transmitted within, whether it's a light frequency produced from them or a sound frequency.
That's right. It's called the dopant in the crystal. It's what tunes the crystal. It's why a trace iron in a quartz makes it into citrine amethyst, where the iron geometry is then doping, which is to say tuning the crystal cavity. And the climax condition of that is what's called the fire crystal, or the Tuoi stone, or the Girku, or the Silmarion, which actually is the ancient mystic communication device of Enki, and that's described pretty well in Anton Parks.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up, basically the kind of like the genesis of Tolkien, which is the Silmarillion.
Absolutely, yes. The stones of the sea, or the fire crystal of Atlantis, was a real piezoelectric physics. And it was literally about phase conjugating. Again, you start with the perfect hex shadow, which is the cross-section of the crystal of quartz, which was the cross-section of the fire crystal. And, the physicist who did the work after Casey talked about Atlantean fire crystal was Sutton. And I worked with him, or we knew him. And Louis Acker, who wrote the Handbook of Astrology, was our partner who, too much LSD, he remembered his Atlantean priest lifetimes and wrote papers on the Atlantean fire crystal and helped design the original Star Mother kit. So, we did a lot of work on that. And the physics is actually quite clear. And implosive capacitance is possible in a crystal. And that's actually what the Koski-Frost crystal was. It was a quartz crystal cube, which generated 600 times its own weight in gravity by a phase conjugate low-frequency pump wave, which we now know what that is rotating a phase conjugate field is what gravity is, but that's pretty advanced science here.
Well, if we even just looked at it from the point of view of the Girku or Enki or Saam, or however we want to, so if we use the word or the name Enki, who was the guardian of the tree of knowledge, that brings us back to that same Gnostic text that I was referring to, the Eo, and it said that once you name the Azozio, and you claim 4555 and seal yourself with the seal of 8, you will meet Saam. Now, I've had that experience, and I would love to replicate it. Does that, but I don't know how, I don't know what I did to create that, other than I'm always meditating and working with that. But does that seal of 8 mean anything to you? You see it in churches often. You see it everywhere, really. The seal of 8, right?
It's a cubic geometry that starts four-wave mixing, and the cube that starts all implosion. But also the figure 8 is obviously the torus, the lemniscate, which is, and remember that all of us, when we had our intense Kundalini experiences, I had my intense Kundalini experience. First thing I did, I came back and I wrote a book on Enki. And then Anton Parks and then he comes back and writes a book on Enki. So why isn't meeting Sam the climax experience? Well, it's really very simple. That was the fractal stem cell switching point for the willed mutation of the species. That's where the lightning bolt started. And you have to go back to that point in order to retrieve the memory. So it makes sense.
But how about reproducing it? How about replicating it? Oh, and this brings me to another question I wanted to ask you. So we spoke earlier in one of our mystic views that perhaps ayahuasca is not advisable because of the potential for creating holes in your aura. However, what about the use of cannabis or any of those other perhaps DMT producing? We produce DMT ourselves, so ideally we would want to do that through our own meditation. However, I would like to ask, with this big advent of medicinal marijuana coming in so strongly, what's your thought on that?
Well, actually, I would call myself not an expert. My prejudice was, of course, having so much Bliss and Kundalini experiences that I thought I couldn't handle it, so I didn't do much testing. But my scientific study of these things seemed to agree with most experts, which is that basically shortened attention span and we might say kind of intellectual laziness, which is well documented, particularly for marijuana use among young people, quite dangerous to the long-term health of the aura. And we recommend people measure for holes in their aura. It's not a subjective question. So actually, for people who have certain problems, and in a shamanic context or occasional use possibly, but actually any general long-term use, unfortunately, and I call this the Terence McKenna phenomena, which is failure to recognize that if you give your body the psychoactive chemistry in a way that short circuits the body's ability to make it the chemistry from within, ultimately then the steering wheel passes from you.
Right, and that is what happened to our ancient ancestors. They lost the ability to embed
or to steer the tornado. And even Ananda says, that the difference between the Amun Enlil cult in Egypt and the Atun Enki Sam cult in Egypt was the Amun cult was addicted to mushroom for their psychoactive, whereas the Atun cult used the soma, the acacia, which is a much more sophisticated psychoactive. But in both cases, it's whether the aura actually becomes, able to sustain the steering point of the tornado or becomes fractionated. And Thoth classically narrated a whole series on fractionation of the personality resulting from the gold powder addiction.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me that with whether it's gold powder or whether it's psychoactives, it's whether or not you use them as a tool or a crutch. And I mean, I really see that because as somebody, I came through the 60s. I've done my experimentation, and I've also gone long periods without. And then my dabble, and that initial dabbling is quite profound. That very, that kind of shifting in native neurochemistry to something different than you're walking around neurochemistry, and you can get like all kinds of work done. But if you say, oh, this is good, I'm going to do this for a long time, it almost immediately there's a degradation. It really seems like just occasional shifts to that kind of different neurochemistry is enormously helpful. It's like a tool, but then you need to come back to native neurochemistry in a way.
It's like the classic ayahuasca story. The first time you go, you think you're seeing interstellar through the mycelial spore worms of the mushroom itself. Mm-hmm. But then the second time you go, you realize instead of you looking through the mushroom is looking through you. Mm-hmm. And the physics is that whoever is more centripetal is the one doing the looking.
Uh-huh. Very good. Very, very interesting. So what it's creating would be the same as any of the sacred geometries, and those are often part of the experience too, but it's really the orbit that we're experiencing, right? Like that orbit of light. So we're seeing the shape or the form, which is the information.
And really emphasizing the need to do the homework, to do the exercises, to increase the density of your attention. And that obviously will dissipate if you're always using external crutches. Because ultimately, at the moment of death, that tornado requires the density of your attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. No, I really get that. One of the things, I mean, I kind of always had I've had a few brushes with crossing over. And, but when you mentioned about the conscious death, boy, do I get that. I mean, it is so crucial, and you can understand how compromised that might be if when you cross over, you're under the influence of something. I mean,
or if you're angry, for example, or if you're in a tremendously electrosmog environment, basically you're needing to steer a plasma ball. The Tibetans would use a drum, but there would need to be a discipline to steer a plasma ball. That's why they say you inherit the yearnings of all your ancestors at their moments of death. But if their moments of death was not coherent, then you don't inherit a coherent yearning.
Mm. So
that's really, yeah, go ahead.
With regard to wiring in housing, obviously that creates something you would probably rather not have. Now, is changing the frequencies, like from a 60 to a 50? I mean, what are some of the ways we might address some of the, like, in other words, not so much even the radio frequencies, just the fact that we have wiring running through our walls, and at least for the foreseeable future, at least for the next few months, we're still going to be kind of getting electricity into houses that way. Is there shielding for that? Is it really about addressing the frequency changing from 60 to 50? I mean, what are some of the things you might say on that?
Well, one thing to know is that if the power is turned off, which is to say there's no amperage going through, then there's very little damage.
Right.
So the bottom line is find ways to turn off all those tiny little transformers that are on all the time. You're going to need to locate and turn them off except when you need them. Second thing to do is all that kind of electrosmog junk needs to be in one corner of your house, and the place you sleep and need peace and your meditation needs to be the opposite corner. The other thing to know is that the right angle for where that wiring crosses in a right angle is the most dangerous. If the wire is crossing in a right angle and carrying relatively high current, that is serious electrosmog. Another thing to know is that braiding the wire does help. So if the wire is actually braided with ground, it is helpful. Another thing to know is that there are relays that will shut a wire when the current goes down to zero. But those are the basics. And the other thing is to do a bit of dowsing in place you sleep and find out which wires are causing the problem.
Now, when you say right angles, do you mean like two wires crossing each other at right angles?
Yeah, but even a right-hand turn in the corner wall, that wire in the right-hand turn, when it's carrying relatively high amperage, is making a serious electrosmog problem.
Interesting. Just making that right hand, that 90-degree turn.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so curving the wires and avoiding those things is helpful.
Oh. Okay. Just as we talk about braiding, I was thinking about when I look at the DNA helix, and then thinking about there might be concepts of torsion. Is there any? I mean, when I see I can see where it maybe could kind of shorten or lengthen, and that might be part of a torsion field. Am I onto anything there, or is?
Yeah, the Russians invented the idea of torsion field, and what they meant by it is almost identical to what Bearden called scalar, which we now know is the generation of a longitudinal. The classic example was in the old psychotronic experiment was you take a 20-foot piece of wire and touch both ends to your car battery and you blow up. But if you take that same 20-foot piece of wire and you braid it into a caduceus, it'll stay cool when you hook it to the same car battery. But if you point it at someone's solar plexus, they will get nausea. And that was the beginning of learning the physics of how a conjugate cascade produces a longitudinal, which they called scalar. And that is classically the function, one of the primary functions of DNA. Actually, that's why it's all decagonal golden ratio based from stem to stern, because it's designed to embed longitudinal components, because that's how interstellar DNA radio works.
Well, bringing up Bearden, who was known for saying that electromagnetic healing is going to be used on a large scale, and we're really there already. We're there now. Thinking in terms of all of this information about bioarchitecture, is there something we would want for a healing center that we wouldn't necessarily want exposed to our homes, or, as we were talking about some of those very specific energies? Is there anything that would be very positive or anything that'd be very negative to not include?
Well, it's this, it's the same reason a sacred temple is great for healing, but a bit of a dangerous place to live. For the same reason that Therify sessions, 3 to 7 minutes is a good thing, but if you stay in there too long, you got issues. And the Therify exposure to a phase conjugate is a prime example of what sacred space is times 1,000, which is you will create centripetal force, but then you need to go away, you need to ground, you need to hydrate, and you need to detox. Because when you go into the presence of implosion, you don't stay there forever until you're ready, which is the same reason that you don't live in the middle of a lightning bolt, even though you enjoy Kundalini.
That's awesome. And so with Therify, does that imply then a little is good and a lot is not necessarily better? What about
Exactly.
every day for 3 minutes? Is that good?
Well, there's a lot of differences from person to person on what you're treating. We started with 3 to 6 minute sessions, and some people do longer, and some people can handle it, but we do definitely have people with a bit of burnout. And we know why, because you get implosive capacitance to high frequencies, and this is going to break out geopathic, pathologic materials in the blood, actually. So the classic what detox is exactly what's called for. The same way if you go into a sacred space and have an intense bliss experience, you go away, you ground, you hydrate, and you detox, and you get your dreams sorted out because your thoughts speed up so much that ... you need to find which ones are shareable.
So Sam's actually doing me a favor by not coming too often.
Well, it's the same way that, in the movie Powder, well, the lightning is a climax experience.
Yes.
Go ahead, Shelley. I had something that percolated up, but then was that...
Okay, let's go back to the electromagnetic healing and how that works with wave reversal and with time reversed, EM signatures or patterns, time reversal, transforming as healing patterns.
I think the most practical way to talk about that is what we talked about before, what the Sumerians meant by "I will raise a Shem unto the Lord," and in the Bible they translated that "I will make an altar in the church." And now Zechariah Sitchin says, no, Shem means highward firestone, which is to say implosive capacitance, literally access to a black hole. So the ancients wanted to build a Shem unto the Lord because their major problem when they arrived, the Anunnaki, whatever, was premature aging. They needed a little time reversal. That was one of their main reasons for coming here. And what they meant by time reversal or rejuvenation field was something very specific. It wasn't exactly winding back the clock. It was taking the body back to a position of more charge implosion, which is the effect of rejuvenation, which is the real meaning of negentropy and the only real meaning of time reversal. So that's what the ancient sacred sites, why people run around looking for sacred sites, actually. Anton Parks and Sitchin, they all say the war is over the Stargate, Uru Asa LM, Jerusalem, the place where the Uru, dragon, Asa, queen, make the L phase shift. The Stargate is a place where you have a war, but if the Stargate's broken, cancel the war. And that's what they should do for Jerusalem. And so the reason the war is over the Stargate was simple, because that's the place where not just age reverse is possible, immortality is possible, but where plasma projection is possible, which is the only way back through the heart of the sun and the only way out of here in the whole story. So then that's why the famous story is that Akhenaten's real job from the Syrians, if you believe, out of Egypt and House of the Messiah and Sun King Akhenaten and Solar King Akhenaten, book by Daniel Stewart, was that his real job assignment from the Syrians was to build a solar temple plasma projector, because our gene pool was toast unless there was not a place you could go like a Stargate and have a collective bliss experience and project yourself through the heart of the sun. And if you couldn't do that, you were toast and stuck in kindergarten. And that's what Amarna Amenti was, actually. And that's what the urge for Jerusalem was about.
One
of the things why it's so critical to teach our children about bliss. Go ahead, Rod.
Well, I was just thinking about the telomeres, and also with Dan had mentioned about the kind of going back to the non-differentiation of stem cells and being able to take something that's rusty and bring it back to non-rust. I mean, in every case, I'm seeing kind of like a restoration to where something could almost stay if it wasn't for negentropic effects. Go ahead.
It's really clear electrically that a stem cell is named stem because it's the root of the fractal of growth. Growth is defined by fractality. And so the root of the fractal is obviously the place where compression was perfect. And so dedifferentiation of stem cell is one of the classic functions of a conjugate field. Hence, Therify is being proven for stem cell dedifferentiation. It means it can go back to the root of the fractal of the growth array, the place where compression was perfected. And that's where there is the throat for the arrival of the maximum constructive interference, and therefore all the growth information lies.
Well, that brings me to the concept of telomeres, where it looks to me like the negentropic aspect on our telomeres is the shortening, where if we can, no?
A telomere is like
entropic aspect is telomere shortening.
Yeah.
A telomere is like a cap on a shoestring that prevents it from unraveling. It's the classic metaphor. Now, classic biophysics sees the decay of the telomere causing aging because then the shoestring unravels, namely your DNA thread. However, I see it a little differently. I see the telomere as being the bounce point which allows the waves to conjugate. If there's not a still point at the end of the standing wave, it can't bounce back and therefore can't conjugate. The guitar string would be useless if it couldn't bounce off the still point of each end being fixed.
Right. Okay. But would part of, with the concept of like the monatomic gold, is part of what they were looking for was to kind of keep their telomeres from unraveling?
Well, the story, if we're to use the metaphor of the story of the Anunnaki, Elohim, Nephilim, the fallen, what did fallen mean? Well, too many thousand years of cloning and the DNA lost vitality. Look at Dolly the sheep.
Yeah.
and we're doing Groundhog Day with that story. So the decay of their vital function, they had learned to use electric fields like the Shem to prevent aging, but in fact they were losing their soul, which meant DNA had stopped imploding or phase conjugating. So looking for a heart of gold and growing old, looking for a pure fractal AU aura, the origin of thing, the Orion, the Aryan. And so their addiction to gold powder was related to their inability to produce vitality or bliss, actually, because they lost the skill to make a soul. That's really what Humpty Dumpty's egg story is about. All the king's horses couldn't make an egg that had a soul, which is what Inanna Returns is about. And so physics of what is a soul, namely phase conjugate implosion that connects it to the DNA radio across stars, is exactly what the Anunnaki lost. And their urge for a form of immortality that works, because they found a form of immortality that didn't work, a mechanical form of immortality that was actually a prison. That's what they found.
Right.
Right. Well, attaining compassion and bliss kind of release us from the miasma permeating our current paradigm of fear and separation. And really what we're talking about here for bliss is to bring us back into an understanding and an ability to interact as oneness, not just grasp kind of the linear concept, but to really be able to live as one. And I know we've kept you here a long time, but perhaps we could invite you back again to continue this story, unless, Rad, you have something pressing that we need for tomorrow's meeting on bioarchitecture?
Well, I wanted to ask one more question based on the diagram that Dan has with the village kind of shaped almost like in a horseshoe, and then you have that one building that kind of is situated in a place where I guess where the sacred spiral kind of would come in, and that's where they would talk to the ancestors.
It's called fractality in African architecture. The village structure was the same as the house structure, was the same as the altar structure, and embeddability. It's kind of a horseshoe within a horseshoe.
Right.
Perfect in closest capacitance.
So if we were to construct, let's say we actually were to make a small housing development in that shape, but they weren't quite so where they were going to talk to their ancestors, would that place, where that building was located, would that be like good for a dining room, a community center, a performance hall? Again, if people didn't quite go the whole contacting the ancestors thing, in that part where that talking to the ancestors altar would be raised, is there something in like more of a modern community out structure that, like I said, like a community center, a dining hall, or something that might work there just as well? Or would there be
actually the classic implosion spot capacity, which is the sweet spot in a dome, for example, classically in sacred architecture, that space is left open and empty. And that is a place for performance and bliss. It's not a place for sleeping or dining,
Right.
but it's a place for where you enter the perfectly shareable wave.
Okay.
Use it as sacred space.
So a community center that was also performance hall or something.
Yes, a bliss space.
Excellent. Well, that's really.
Or maybe we just need to teach them a new concept about speaking with their ancestors.
Well,
Maybe
remember,
they can speak with their ancestors.
the place
they
that the
reframe it.
The place where the Kogi could speak with their ancestors, the capacitance, was fractal. It was the place of perfect charge distribution. And just to close with the thought, as you emphasized about the nature of bliss, this conversation can get very esoteric, but it really boils down to something very simple. People need to become aware of attracting a charge in everything they do, chi or gracefulness defined electrically. And it defines how you select your clothing and your place and your air and your food and your friends and your hugging and your entertainment is all about attracting charge. So your aura gets bigger. That simple.
And shareable thoughts is it sounds so innocuous, but
yes,
it is so huge.
That it's huge. Absolutely. Exactly.
And secrets, I mean, one of the things I've always tried to differentiate is between privacy and secrets. And I think we're all entitled to some privacy, and privacy doesn't really impede shareability. Secrets do.
And actually, nature's electricity is the opposite of secrets.
Okay, well, I think...
Thank you very much. We've really had fun here. And let's make this all shareable.
We intend to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you all. And God bless you all. Until next time.